You know, I have to say, PJ and I, are one of our next panelists, we're just talking about this. We probably go to more conferences a year than we ever want to realize. But I have to say that the level of and the diversity of perspectives that are up here, the level of discourse and the conversations between the audience and the speakers has just been phenomenal, and wish that there were more summits like this. So the folks on the planning committee here have really just done one hell of a job. So just really good. My name is Tony CALANDRO. I am the founder of Purposeful Strategies. We're a social impact firm that quantifies the return on investment that companies can stand to gain by looking at and innovating around social issues that impact their communities. Today we've got the last panel, and it's about change agents. It's the business perspective. So to sort of frame this conversation up, how many, I'm sure there's a few of us in the audience that are my age or maybe a little older who remembers Milton Friedman. Does anybody remember Milton Friedman? And his famous saying really sort of framed sort of the latter part of the 20th century's view of how business viewed its role in society. And his famous quote was, "The only social responsibility that companies have in society is to make more money, to make more profits." And so you fast forward now to today, and there's another P word that's starting to become part of the conversation with companies. And so it's not just profit, it's profit and purpose. And you've got an overwhelming number of companies. I never thought I'd ever see in my day the number of companies that are really becoming change agents in all of this for a whole host of reasons. But you've got Larry Fink as one example, the CEO of BlackRock. BlackRock is the largest asset management firm in the world. It's got roughly $7 trillion in assets. And about a month ago, he released a statement and said that if companies that we invest in do not also address societal issues, we may no longer invest in you. And that's just really just the tip of the iceberg. And there's a new activist, a new category of activists today, and that's the CEO. And who would have ever thought that CEOs would be getting involved and taking stands in hot button issues? And there's an expectation that CEOs will become involved in these issues and lead the change that we need. And so today we've got, this panel is really about business perspectives, and it's really sort of taking two different perspectives on it. One is the pace of change. That's the common theme of this panel, and the pace of change needs to accelerate. And with that, there's new economic models that need to be developed, and business needs to help drive those. And so our first speaker is really a global expert on this. His name is Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. He's the director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. He has earned many accolades and wears many hats that he's accumulated over the course of his career, but there's a few here that are very relevant for this conversation. He was appointed by Ban Ki-moon about 18 years ago. The United Nations created the UN Millennium Goals, and it was really government's attempt to use a framework to address the most systemic issues that face society today, whether they're social or whether they're environmental. And that ended in 2015, and the successor framework, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, he's also intimately involved in that too. And the one big distinction of that is it's also now, it's not just a government framework, but it's also a business framework that they can use to begin to really figure out how they can best address these issues as well. And so he heads up the Solutions Network for the Sustainable Development Goals. So our first speaker, please welcome Dr. Jeffrey Sachs.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and let me say how pleased I am to be at St. Louis University. You learn something important early in one's career, and that is whenever Peter Raven invites you someplace, you accept. And so that's why I'm here, very simply. Of course, I'm delighted to be here, but I'm here because Peter kindly invited me, and I would go anywhere he invites me to. Because he's such a wonderful, remarkable scientist and leader and inspiration for all of us. I want to talk about one specific practical aspect of our big challenge, and that is human-induced climate change. just to give you a sense of where we are and what we need to do. And everything I'm going to say is completely scientifically accepted, and almost everything you hear is phony from our politicians. So we have to understand that we're in a house of mirrors because of the corruption of our politics. And we need to understand what is the real situation and then tell our politicians what to do and to stop talking and do something. So the situation is that we have now warmed the planet through greenhouse gas emissions by about 1.1 degrees Celsius. There is no doubt about this, and there's no doubt about the science of this either. This was understood already at the end of the 19th century. And indeed, the first paper on how humans would change the planet through global warming was written in 1896 by a Swedish Nobel chemist named Svante Arrhenius. This is all known. With the emissions of greenhouse gases that we've already put into the atmosphere, there is more warming ahead, even if we didn't burn another ton of coal or burn another ton of petroleum, because Earth takes time to catch up with what we're doing. The main reason being that the oceans have a huge heat capacity, and they're still warming in line with the change of the energy balance that has come from the chemistry change of the atmosphere caused by our use of fossil fuels mainly. So we have another maybe half a degree Celsius that is about 1 degree Fahrenheit already built in more, even if we don't change anything more. Okay? But we're not stopping. We continue to burn coal, oil, and gas, and we continue to emit other greenhouse gases like methane, which comes partly from the fracking, partly from the livestock, partly from the landfills, partly from other chemical processes. We continue to emit nitrous oxide and other industrial chemicals. We're on a trajectory of 3 or 4 degrees warming compared to the baseline for all of these numbers, which is the temperature before industrialization began. So when I say that the planet's already warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius, that means compared to a base before the world began industrializing. There are technical issues. You could read volumes about exactly the baseline. But maybe it's something like 1880 to 1900 is a useful baseline. That's what some scientists use because it's appropriate for very technical reasons. And we could end up with this century 4 degrees warmer than now. Now here's some important things to understand. With what we've done so far, warming of 1.1 degree, and even more like last year when we had a big El Nino, which reached almost 1.3 degrees because of the special temporary effects of El Nino. We are already in a climate that is unlike the climate during the entire period of human civilization. We're already out of what the scientists call the Holocene period. We're already setting in motion some very, very profound and dangerous changes. The last time Earth was as warm as it is now was 115,000 years ago in a geologic period called the Eemian period. When the Earth was at this temperature for maybe some centuries, the sea level was 9 meters higher than now, because we have warmed enough to lead to the disintegration of the ice sheets. Maybe a little bit more warming, but surely in the range of what is going to occur. We're already, in other words, in a tremendously dangerous era. And last year, you saw we had Hurricane Harvey, then Hurricane Irma, then Hurricane Maria, 3 in a row, slam into the Caribbean and into Houston. We had massive forest fires in California, all climate linked, all climate change linked, with damages over just a few days of $306 billion. That set a record, but all over the world, every place that I visit as a senior UN official, and I go to dozens of countries every year, I meet scientists, I meet heads of state, I meet farmers. This is a worldwide phenomenon. We're in an era of extraordinary danger that is getting worse. What do we need to do? We need to stop emitting the greenhouse gases. That can't be accomplished from one day to the next, but it can be accomplished within a time that at least gives us a fighting chance to avoid disaster. And the most important greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, the most important anthropogenic greenhouse gas. That means human-driven greenhouse gas. The carbon dioxide is emitted primarily from the use of coal, oil, and gas, and about 15% or 20% from land use change, such as deforestation or degradation of grasslands or other adverse effects, typically through agriculture, or feedback effects, because as warming and drying occurs in some places, then forests start to give up their carbon dioxide, so you get what's called a positive feedback, which is not positive at all, which is potentially disastrous for us. We have to shift out of coal, oil, and gas, natural gas. I can tell you as a development economist, and I've been studying and teaching economics now for 45 years, coal, oil, and gas were crucial for the global development. They're not by themselves evil or wrong, and we would never have had a modern economy without coal, oil, and gas. But it was discovered about 125 years ago that they have a very serious side effect. It wasn't understood then. It's part of the quantum mechanical properties of carbon dioxide. It absorbs infrared radiation and therefore warms the planet. So we can't go on doing what we've been doing. We have to stop emitting carbon dioxide. And that means a change of how we use energy. Now, there's very good news, which is that we have ample ways to have a modern, high technology, sophisticated, prosperous economy without emitting carbon dioxide. Because solar radiation provides roughly 10,000 times more power than we use, because wind power can be harnessed at low cost, because hydroelectric power, geothermal energy, and if we choose nuclear energy, are all essentially zero carbon energy sources. Because we can ride in our cars, and even cars will like better in the future, with battery electricity, or trucks with the hydrogen fuel cells, with the hydrogen produced with renewable energy, or planes that are flying on synthetic hydrocarbons produced by renewable energy and CO2 and catalysts to produce hydrocarbon chains. In other words, I'm in the social science side. That means I don't know very much, but the scientists know a lot, and the engineers know a lot. And we have pathways to safety. How much time do we have? No time. What does it mean, no time? It means we're already in a danger zone. It means we've already built in enough danger to go around. It means we have to make the exit from a fossil fuel-based economy globally. It's not just the US, it's every place, as soon as we can, without destroying prosperity, without creating war, without creating chaos, without throwing people into extreme duress and poverty. So this has to be done thoughtfully. It will take about 30 years because you have to roll over the entire fleet of vehicles. You have to build a new power infrastructure. You need to build new infrastructure. It's not easy. It's got to be done everywhere in the world. It requires an organized, concerted, global effort. The Chinese are on board because they're extraordinarily vulnerable and because they know what the technologies are. In fact, one of the reasons why the White House is so scared of China is that their Chinese are investing heavily in the new technologies. Solar, new wind turbines, ultra-high voltage direct current transmission technologies, smart grids, new materials, extremely impressive. We're going to be using a lot of those technologies in the future. Very, very impressive. The Indians are desperate because climate change for India is a disaster. A densely populated, highly vulnerable region of the world with a lot of drylands dependent on a monsoon climate that is under tremendous threat. Horrifying, actually, what could happen. The United States now is the only country declaring that it is not on this agenda. So that's what we need to understand. 193 countries signed the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Climate Agreement does not mention a country. If you go online, it's a set of general principles. One head of state said, "That's unfair." You know who? Ours. 192 are trying to implement this agreement. So what is it that's actually happening in this country? What's happening is that our democracy has been suborned by massive corporate corruption. Just so you understand. The week before Donald Trump announced that the US would pull out, 22 senators, all Republicans, wrote a letter to him calling on him to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Why? Because they're all on the take. They're on the take of David and Charles Koch, two brothers, each with $60 billion of net worth, who own pipelines and refineries. They're on the take from the oil industry. ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and many others. We're experiencing the breakdown of our democracy by corporate corruption. If you want the good news, these politicians are not as stupid as they look. If you want the bad news, they're far more corrupt. They don't care about your children. They don't care about my children. They don't care about our grandchildren. It's disgusting. And it's completely out of control. They're dishonest. They're not interested at all. Look at Mr. Scott Pruitt. He is despicable as an individual. He is personally corrupt because they're so low-life that they can't even stop their personal corruption. But his whole life has been to take money from the oil industry to say anything. That's what we're facing. And we can't put up with it anymore. We're grown-ups. We have responsibility for our children, for our communities, for our grandchildren. And they are just fulminant liars. There's no debate about this science and about the threats. They don't care, and the only reason is the money. That's the only reason. By the way, the jobs question isn't even a question. The number of jobs, you know how many coal miners there are? About 20,000 out of 150 million workers. And those are lousy jobs. They kill you. So if we cared at all, the first thing we would do would be to help people to train for healthy jobs. And the green industries would create so much more employment, so much better conditions of work, new livelihoods, competitiveness for our country. So it's nothing to do with the jobs, with the economy. This is completely bogus. It has to do with greed. Uncontrolled, unalloyed greed of a tiny, tiny part of our population. Tiny sector of the economy by number, a few owners of mega wealth, and corruption of our politics. So please, talk to your congressmen, talk to your senators. We cannot do this as grown-ups. Let this happen. But it has almost slipped out of our control. Now, what should we do? It's actually not that complicated. Of course, there are many, many choices. And so it's not simple and it's not trivial. But the United States, like many other parts of the world, is blessed with vast, vast renewable energy. You know, we have everything on this continent. And especially, by the way, if we view it as a continent, because if Canada, the US, and Mexico work together, we have even more because Canada has vast hydroelectric potential in the north that is underdeveloped. And hydro plays a special role these days because you can use the reservoirs for almost batteries. You pump the water up, and that's a kind of way to store intermittent renewable energy. Mexico has vast solar power. We shouldn't be building a wall. We should be importing sunshine from Sonora. We're crazy. I mean, we're just so incredibly missing everything right now in this country. So the United States, many studies have shown, could provide all the power for a growing economy with the wind, the solar, and the hydro that we have here. If you want to use some nuclear, which many of my colleagues say should be part of the mix also, some say no way, but others say yes, That makes it a little bit easier, of course, in the sense that it's a base load of massive zero carbon potential. But there's no shortage of the resources. This is not about the silliness that I get in, I wouldn't call it hate mail, but despise mail maybe, that comes frequently. Do you still drive, Professor Sachs? Do you still fly? You're a hypocrite. This is not the point about climate change. The point is how the technology works. And there's no reason why the car has to be based on petroleum. We know it. It's obvious. There's no reason why the plane has to be emitting carbon dioxide. There's no reason why the current processes cannot be changed, and indeed, the prices, the costs, the technology have improved so vastly that they're basically competitive in many, many contexts with fossil fuels. But the fossil fuel industry is trying to turn off every limit on their bad behavior. And politicians go nuts with this, by the way. Even, I like Justin Trudeau. Don't you like Justin Trudeau? He's got a nice smile. He's a nice guy. I know him personally. He's really green. He's out there campaigning for more pipelines right now for Canadian oil shale. So that just shows you don't have to be crazy like our president to do this. This is politics. Ours is nuts, sorry to say. Sorry, my personal view. Not just my personal view. But Justin Trudeau, who's perfectly fine and normal, is on the same gig right now because he wants to hold the politics of the state of Alberta. So they don't want the NDP to lose the Alberta elections, and Alberta would be really upset if they can't get their pipeline out. Could we conceivably care? Is this really the basis for how our planet should be run? That we have to continue to give these crazy illusions, which they were all illusions anyway, of that gold rush. It was an oil sands rush in Alberta which went bad, that we still have to cater to that somehow? Anyway, I tell them the truth, which is you invest in those pipelines, we will bankrupt you. Because there's no way in the world that it will be safe to use those pipelines over the next 25 years. You will go bankrupt. And by the way, the same is true of ExxonMobil and Chevron. They will be footnotes in history, bad footnotes, footnotes of bad corporate behavior, but they're going to disappear unless it becomes ExxonMobil Wind Energy Company. Because there's no role for them in a safe planet going forward. They don't know it yet. They ran this country for 100 years. They decided which wars we would fight. They had a whole US military defending their supply lines to the Middle East. They're arrogant. They have lied for 40 years on climate change. They're lying still. But that's what we face. So, in a way, it's not so complicated. We have good alternatives. They will get even better if we invest in them. We have partners around the world to do this. We have a pretty clear timeline, and that is by 2050, we ought to be out of the fossil fuel business. We need to think ahead. We need to do a word that we used to tolerate, now we despise, plan. We really need a planning commission, by the way. We need a Department of Planning in Washington. Do we really want to live from tweet to tweet? No, we can't. Do we really want to have a policy based on a 2-year political cycle? No. When I was young, they were planning the interstate highway system. That was a good thing. It was set in 1955. Jimmy Carter finished it 25 years later. There were plans. There were maps. There were engineers. There was a strategy. That's what we need. If we do it, we'll make it because we don't lack the know-how, the resources, and it's clear from here the will to survive and to leave a better world for our children. Thank you very much.